Hello, everybody, for signing in and taking a look at this video. My name is Frey Kruk. I am the secretary for LifeTech. LifeTech is an organization that is dedicated to pro-life issues from a scientific viewpoint across the spectrum, from the inception of life to the end of life and everywhere in between. So we look at things like abortion and issues around abortion, but we also look at things like the treatment of Down syndrome's children. We look at issues around euthanasia and things like that. We look at some cutting edge research that's being done into the preservation of problem pregnancies and things like that. And of course, these days, we also look at vaccines, which is something that's affecting everybody's quality of life, with information and misinformation and conflicts, and while we would like to separate this out from the political as much as possible, it's virtually impossible to. But we will try to keep this to a factual, historical, non-emotional basis as much as we can. And to help us with that today, I would like to introduce my guest, Pamela Acker. I believe I've said that correctly. She is the author of a book called Vaccination: A Catholic Perspective, and we'll give you information on how to get that and look at it later on. But excuse me. So first of all, Pamela, could you go ahead and introduce yourself, since you're more qualified than I?
Sure. So I currently work as a teacher. I have a background in biology, got my master's from Catholic U in 2012. And most people who've seen me on LifeSite are familiar with my story of why I got my master's instead of my PhD, because I was working in a lab that was developing HIV vaccines. And it turned out that the particular vaccine that I was working on, one of my other coworkers was developing her part of that vaccine platform in HEK293 cells. And so most people have now heard of HEK293 cells because of the current COVID vaccine candidates, especially Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. So I left the Catholic U's biology department with my master's as a consolation prize for holding onto my ethical convictions. And I've been working as a teacher and a researcher since then. So I've taught high school biology, college biology, and also I recently published a book, as you mentioned, Vaccination: A Catholic's Perspective, for the Kolbe Center for the Study of Creation. So I got asked to start this book actually before COVID. Almost 2.5 years ago. And the head of the Kolbe Center was just very interested in, how does this medical paradigm affect the way that we think about health and the way that we treat disease? And, is vaccination kind of the best option? Are there better options? So he asked me to look into this question, and I ended up spending 2 years at it and publishing the book last December, right around the time that Pfizer started rolling out their vaccine. So it was incredibly providential timing.
All right. One of the things that I realized when I was going through some of your articles in the work is that, I'm not a biologist. I am a geek by profession. That is on my business card, with a strong minor in being a nerd. So I know a lot, at least a little, about a lot of things. But I noticed that I was kind of getting confused when I was reading some of the terminology, and I was hoping that you could help me, as well as our viewers, on what is the difference between stem cells, like embryonic stem cells, and the fetal cell lines that you talk about, which are being used in these vaccines.
Sure. A lot of people have this confusion, so it's not that uncommon, actually. So I'm glad you asked that question. So when embryonic stem cells are used in a project, and these are kind of universally condemned by the church. There was the last magisterial statement on bioethics was Dignitas Personae, which was in 2008. So a lot of the recent things that are published on the morality of the COVID vaccine don't have nearly as high a magisterial authority as that document. So I kind of always ground it back in that document. And it's very clear that embryonic stem cells are completely unethical for Catholics to use, or to use anything developed from these, because this involves the creation and immediate destruction of human embryos. So usually this means that you're using in vitro fertilization to create zygotes, allowing the zygotes to grow to a particular stage in development, and then destroying all the cell adhesions so you can separate the cells out into sort of a single entities, and then you're doing experiments on those cells. And that because it involves the immediate creation and destruction of embryos, a lot of people find this a lot more clear to say, okay, well, I know that morally this is not licit, right? The cell lines, people get a little bit more confused because they want to make this remote material cooperation with evil argument. And they say, well, the cell line was created from tissue that was taken from an aborted baby in the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s, or actually the most recent one was in 2015 that was developed. And so cells that you take from an organism, if you try to grow them in a petri dish, they won't survive for very long. This is called primary cell culture. And so they'll survive for a little while, long enough to do an experiment or two. And then you have to go back and get more tissue and take it out and do the same thing again. And there are a lot of experiments that are being done currently in this way with fetal tissue. But a fetal cell line is actually, you take the tissue out of the body and you submit it to a process called immortalization. So you're taking genes, usually from viruses, and inserting them into the cells that you've isolated from the baby. And these cells will, genes will do one of two things. So, and they're all kind of linked to cancer. So they will either take off or shut down a tumor suppressor gene, or they will turn on an oncogene. So a tumor suppressor gene stops cells from dividing indiscriminately like cancer cells do. So the reason you get a tumor is because you just have these cells dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing. So if you can turn on these cancer genes in the cells in the petri dish, you can lengthen the life of your cell line. You can immortalize it. So you want to either turn off the genes that are stopping it from becoming cancerous, or you want to turn on a gene that causes it to become cancerous, and then it will grow indefinitely in cell culture. Although the term immortalization is a little bit misleading because it's not necessarily immortal. It's not actually good to continue to pass these cells in culture. So, I'm growing my cells, and then I take some from this dish and start a new dish, and I take some from this dish and start a new dish, kind of indefinitely, because over time mutations will accumulate in these cell lines, and their ability to be used in the laboratory diminishes over time, even though you can culture them for a very long period of time, because they're gradually becoming actually like less and less genetically normal. And so the experiments that you do in them will be less and less applicable to actual human cells.
Kind of a genetic game of telephone. Just
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
time it passes from somebody, the message gets a little more mangled.
Yeah. No, this is actually, it's a problem called genetic entropy. That actually even occurs generationally. So
Sure.
your kids will have more mutations than you, because they'll inherit yours, and then they'll have their own, and then their kids will have more mutations than them because they'll inherit, the ones that you had and the ones that your kids had, and then they'll add their own. So yeah, it's everything's kind of degrading over time.
So these embryonic stem cells, and going mainly from what's been in the news and everything,
Sure.
unfortunately I'm of an age where I think of things that are new or 20 years ago, but
Yeah.
it's fairly recent. I remember that in the 90s there was a lot of news and regulations about what these were going to do. They were promised that they were going to solve everything. I remember Michael J. Fox, who was a Parkinson's sufferer,
Yeah.
testifying in Congress about how that stopping embryonic stem cell research was going to condemn people to death in horrible ways because it was the only way to research things, which we'll kind of get back to that in a moment. But the fetal cell lines have been used for a lot longer, which I was surprised by. So can you tell us a bit about when that practice started?
Sure. It actually goes all the way back to the 1930s and the development of the polio vaccine. So most people think, oh, well, again, we have this sort of confusion about whether it's morally illicit to use vaccines that were developed in aborted fetal cells, because people think that it doesn't, um, they think that the fetal cell lines weren't developed specifically for use in vaccines. And then B, they think that because of this, that makes it somehow morally different. But going back to Dignitas Personae, it doesn't make it any different at all. The document is very clear that it doesn't matter what purpose the cell lines were developed for. The morality doesn't change. It doesn't matter whether it was developed specifically for use in vaccines or not. It's still not licit to use these cell lines in research, right? But they were actually originally developed for use in the polio vaccine. So and I forget the two scientists. I think one of them was Hayflick. but they got Nobel Prizes in the 1930s for taking tissue out of electively aborted babies. Now these were this is before abortion was, carte blanche legal in the U.S. So people are like, well, how did that even happen? Well, they were working out of Bellevue General Hospital, or with Bellevue General Hospital, which was a facility that had a ward for the care of feeble-minded individuals, particularly women who were pregnant would come there. And at this time, the eugenics movement was really kind of building up ahead of steam with the Buck versus Bell decision, and making it legal to sterilize women who were considered to be feeble-minded so that they could no longer reproduce. They would actually do abortions on women who were deemed feeble-minded, and they would do hysterectomies at the same time. So they're removing the entire womb, baby and all, which is a very sterile way to do this. So if you're removing the baby while it's still in the womb, you're not introducing any possibility of bacterial contamination. And that's a great and necessary condition for tissue culture. If you're going to start a cell line from something, you want to make sure that it's free of any viral contamination, free of any bacterial contamination. So they were actually using the tissue from these babies that were being removed from these women who were being forcibly sterilized to develop cell lines so that they could culture viruses in these cell lines. Because viruses, you can't grow up a virus without a cell, because a virus is an obligate parasite. So if I'm going to make a virus-based vaccine, I have to have some cells to grow it in. Now, influenza uses chicken eggs, so that's where they're getting their cells. There was a version of the polio vaccine that used monkey cells, but then they found that was contaminated with a simian virus called SV40. And there's some concern that SV40 is implicated in the development of certain human cancers. So this became a problem. So human cell lines were kind of settled on as an ideal candidate, because if I have a human cell line and I can make sure that it's free of bacterial and viral contamination, then I shouldn't have problems introducing any zoonotic viruses into the population, and I shouldn't have any problems with allergic reactions. So some people can't take certain vaccines because they have an egg allergy, or they're made with bovine serum albumin and they have an allergy to beef or something like that. So you can't really be allergic to humans because you are human. So it was thought that, well, if we do these in human cell lines, this is just going to be better for these reasons. And then there's some viruses that won't grow in animal cell lines. So chickenpox, I think, is one of these. It won't grow in monkey cells or dog cells or hamster cells. It only is going to grow in human cells. So this was kind of the justification for, well, we need a source of human cells, but it was perfectly, there are ways to develop human cell lines that are perfectly ethical. Even neonatal cell lines, you could use, for example, blood from the umbilical cord. You could use cells from the placenta. You could use even cells from neonatal foreskin after circumcision. There's all kinds of different ways that you can get ethical cells from an infant. And these cells are considered to be better for developing cell lines because they haven't divided very many times yet. So if you take cells from me, and I'm almost 40, those cells have divided multiple times already. They're reaching what's called the Hayflick limit, where they're not going to be able to divide anymore. They're going to senesce and die. So if I try to immortalize cells from my body, they're probably not going to have as long of a lifespan in petri dishes. If I try to immortalize cells from a very young child, or cells from the placenta or from the cord blood, those cells are going to have a longer lifespan, is the thought here. They're also going to be less likely to be infected with any kind of viruses or particularly viruses, because if I have a retrovirus, then that's going to integrate itself into my cells, and that's going to cause problems with cells that are grown up in the laboratory. So the idea is that if I take cells from a younger individual, they'll grow longer in petri dishes, and they're less likely to be contaminated. So the justification is in one sense scientifically sound, but obviously there's a huge ethical problem with taking tissue from aborted babies in order to have these kinds of benefits from a scientific perspective.
The question that I have on that is really there's a couple different items there. Obviously, one of them I think that you've actually you can go ahead and take your sip. I'll go ahead and talking because you were doing a
Yeah.
lot there.
Yep.
But one of the things that I was wondering about is how much of using these fetal cell lines and this aborted tissue is if it was the only way to do something, then that could be used as a potential justification where ethics aside, as much as you could do that, you could say the ends almost justify the means. But from what you're saying, it sounds like there are other ways to do this. So are those other ways more difficult, and that's why you would go with the aborted babies? Or are there other considerations that are coming into play that might be now kind of a little moving out of the science? Or rather, are they scientific, or are these more economic? Is it easier
Mhm.
to work with the aborted babies? Does this become almost a self-generating thing, working with abortion providers in order to get material quickly, which pushes a need for more abortions and so on?
Yeah, the whole history of this is very complicated and sordid. And Monica Seeley actually wrote a two-part article for Catholic World Report back in May, I think, where she really did a deep dive into all of this stuff. I think even better than I could cover. But um, I do know that there were at the time that these fetal cell lines were being developed in the 1930s. There were other options on the table. I mean, there were other human cell lines, there were other animal cell lines that could have been used. And so the question of why aborted fetal cells, you know, there's not a purely scientific justification for that. There just really isn't. And so then you start looking at moral justifications, political justifications. Was this part of the push to legalize abortion or normalize abortion? Was this part of the push to normalize eugenics? Um, was this at some level influenced by the demonic? I those are questions that are a little too big for me as one individual to tackle. But certainly we know that abortion is very evil. And we know that sin corrupts the intellect, and we know that people who are involved in these kinds of things, even if they're not Catholic, even if they're not conscious that they're doing something gravely sinful, when you perform a gravely sinful action, it still has natural law consequences. And these people are profoundly affected by what they're doing, and their intellects are darkened. And so, the decisions that they're making are maybe not actually the most logical or moral, simply because of being involved in sins like this. So there's just like there's a lot that goes into that, and a lot of it is probably better addressed by a theologian than by a lay
Well,
science.
interestingly enough, having recently talked to a pastor on this
Oh,
very subject, who is actually Pastor Walter Boss, who's also talking as part of this, he specifically points out that even though the marketing is that, oh, it's an outpatient procedure, it's just a
mhm,
clump of cells and so on,
mhm.
his personal experience is that it leaves a mark, it leaves a shadow,
Oh, it
um,
does.
that doesn't go away. And a lot of the
Yeah.
work he does is with the counseling and help and talking about forgiveness, but it also
Mhm.
marks the people who work in the clinics and to actually perform the procedures. And we've heard stories of that from people that had been
Right.
involved with that industry and then left it kind of again and again. So
Yeah.
I certainly agree with you're saying we're kind of exiting the realm of the scientific. But on the other hand, he could specifically point to more anecdotally, although I believe he has some evidence in his pamphlet, where incidences of depression, of self-harm, of
Mhm.
suicide, and things like that are elevated after
Mhm.
these procedures. Something else, which is, of course, vigorously opposed by people who are on the side of actually doing these
Right.
abortions.
Yeah. People try to even deny that post-abortion syndrome is a thing. But it's interesting. I was actually just at the Catholic Medical Association's annual conference in Orlando, and I met a number of pro-life advocates there who a lot of people who worked with women who had decided to abort, and how do you deal with the grief and the pain and all the emotions that come with that. But they were recognizing, that because I think that in the early sort of post Roe versus Wade days, the pro life movement kind of had this attitude of like, we stood outside the abortion clinic and we got this woman to not go in and abort her baby, and we saved the baby, and the day is won, and good job, everything's great. And actually, even the woman who chooses not to abort her child suffers from a lot of emotional and psychological disturbance. She suffers from a lot of guilt. She may have trouble bonding with that child. She may feel like there's a secret hanging in the air between her and the child. And this is something that I think is being noticed more recently, because it's a very difficult thing to talk about as a woman and as a mother. It's like you make the decision to kill your child, and then you repent of it, and you still have your child, but you still made that act of the will. You still made an act of the will to choose to kill your child for whatever reason it was, whether it was coercion or fear or lack of knowledge, whatever it was. She still knows, especially if she chose to keep the child, she still knows at a very visceral level, this was the wrong thing to do, but I did it. I did assent to that. And even that affects people profoundly.
I think
You know,
it's a great point. It's something I hadn't really thought about.
yeah, I hadn't really thought about it until this conference either. I was talking with these women, but it even affects children who, too. It affects the child who might know that, mom was going to abort me and then didn't. It can affect those children really, really profoundly. So it has all of these ripple effects. So we can't discount the fact that this is profoundly affecting the people who are involved, especially if they're choosing actively to say, okay, I'm going to develop something that was made from aborted fetal tissue. I mean, that's a whole other level of involvement. That's not out of coercion. That's not out of fear. That's an active choice. It might seem on the surface to some of the people who are making that choice to be very clinical and very dispassionate, but the fact that you are clinically and dispassionately choosing to participate with evil actually makes it worse.
I was just actually thinking it's like being in a marriage and telling your spouse, I was about to cheat on you, but at the last second I decided not to. Thanks.
Right.
It's
Yeah, yeah.
it's not like that can't have any
Or just,
effects.
the even just the, it's not like the heat of the moment
Yeah,
I did something with this other person. It's like I coldly went and picked out another person to commit an act of infidelity with. You
exactly.
know, it's when you're
There's
choosing.
issues there beyond
Yeah,
just the act. It's what led up to that.
right, right. So what led up to these people choosing to use the aborted fetal cells? I don't know, but this is actually a profoundly evil choice.
Now,
You
I
know.
called out something from someone who I'm delighted to say is another past Life Tech speaker. I just talked to him last year, Dr. Paul Byrne, who is a neonatologist, past president of the Catholic Medical Association. He actually spoke with me at length last year in a recording on brain death,
Okay.
and how shockingly in some venues that things like organ harvesting for transplants and things, which
Mhm.
is obviously, I would say my father has a heart transplant. So that's the only reason he's still with us today, is something that when voluntarily agreed to, I am a fan of. But his point was that people are jumping the gun on declaring brain death in order to get to the organs. But he said on an interview with Monica Seeley that speaking of these cell lines, that it's not like the abortion happens and the materials are packed, however, and then shipped off somewhere, and then these cells are harvested. This is actually done, to use the euphemism, while the body is still warm. They're done right away. And
Mhm.
his comment was that the baby is alive when it's dissected to get to those organs and tissues. Is that correct?
That is accurate, and that goes all the way back to the papers. I mean, this is in the scientific literature, and you can find all this information actually on Children of God for Life. They documented with all the footnotes, all the different papers, and Sabin was involved and all these kinds of things. But there's a couple of different references. One of them talks about, removal of the embryo by cesarean section. And so the embryo is immediately taken out of the womb, placed in a sterile towel, and placed at 5 degrees Celsius. So they're literally doing a C-section in the 1930s, taking the baby, putting it on a towel, and putting it in the fridge. It's horrific, and then some of them talk about, the for the WI38 cell line, which is the cell line that the MMR vaccine is produced in. This baby was aborted. The woman chose to do, or no, I'm sorry. This is the baby that the actual virus in the rubella vaccine was extracted from, because the MMR vaccine is doubly immoral, I guess. I mean, it only takes one abortion to be immoral, but the virus itself came from an aborted baby, and the cell line that it's cultured in came from an aborted baby. So the baby that was aborted for the virus, the mother had been exposed to rubella. She chose to abort, I think, within a couple of weeks of that exposure, and they were able to isolate the virus from the baby. And it talks about the literature that talks about developing this vaccine talks about, the baby was removed and immediately dissected. And immediately dissected means they took the baby out and they're already performing the dissection. Like, they're not waiting for the baby to die. They're not actually euthanizing the baby. They are immediately dissecting the baby. And there's another paper, again, from the 1930s that talks about, they were using, they said unmacerated specimens, so specimens that had no damage. So these are not babies that are being, vacuumed out of the womb and pulled to pieces in the process, and so killed in the process. These are babies that are being delivered whole and entire. So unmacerated specimens were delivered to the laboratory, and these tissues were obtained, and in some cases the hearts were still beating. So it's all documented. It's all right there in black and white in the scientific literature in the 1930s. Now, people started to react to these kinds of things, and then they started to use slightly more clinical and removed language, and that's what you'll see in papers now. And this is, again, where Monica Seeley has documented some of these things, and she's talked about the specific euphemisms that they use. And when they use them with animals, it's more clear. When they use them with fetal tissue, they're not as clear, but they're still using the same language. And by extension, if this is what it means when you do it to a rat, this is what it means when you do it to a baby. And they're still harvesting tissue from live babies, because you can't get live tissue from a dead body. And this is, I just kind of keep saying this over and over again in my interviews. You can get skin tissue, doesn't deteriorate for a while, so you can get skin tissue from a recently deceased body. But kidney tissue, so for example, the HEK293 cells, kidney tissue starts to sustain damage from oxygen deprivation before the heart stops beating. Okay, so your kidneys are already, if you're dying, your kidneys are already deteriorating before your heart stops beating. So you need to get this tissue in order to make a cell line. You need to have live cells. You need to get this tissue as fresh as possible. This is not something that you could even remotely say, well, we don't know how this abortion was done. There's no documentation at the hospital for this particular cell line. This could have been a miscarriage. It couldn't have been a miscarriage. Most natural miscarriages, the baby dies long before the body is expelled from the womb, and you can't possibly get live kidney tissue from a baby that's been dead for any length of time, and it's just biologically impossible. And if you try to claim that you can take a dead individual and create a living cell line from them, you're basically advocating spontaneous generation or resurrection of dead tissue. We can't do that. It's not possible. And it's completely untenable to say, that these cell lines were developed in any other way than from living tissue, and living tissue from living bodies.
What about the people that say that you briefly alluded to this specific term that escapes my mind, that saying, well, it's been done and these cell lines exist. So what's the harm in using what's, already out there for research?
This is really, it's a moral theology question. So I'm going to give you my gut instinct
It's fair.
as a Catholic, and then my understanding as a scientist. So my understanding as a scientist is, when you start using HEK293, for example, and you optimize all your media to grow it in. You optimize all your procedures to do experiments on it. You optimize all your petri dishes for the best, growing conditions. You start to develop whole designer lines of things associated with this aborted fetal tissue, right? And so people come to depend on it more and more and more because this is what's in the literature. This is what's been published. This is what's out there. Well, what happens when the HEK293 line senesces? Well, you need another embryonic kidney from another baby that's of the same gestational age and the same gender because you want it to be as similar to the original cell line as possible. So using aborted fetal cell lines does fuel the need for additional aborted fetal cell lines. This is what happened with Wallbacks 2, which was created in 2015. This doesn't just stay in the 1960s and 70s, but it's worse than that because individuals that are interested in fetal tissue research use the use of fetal cells in vaccine development as justification for their own fetal tissue research every single time. And this is just documented over and over and over and over again. If somebody wants to do research with fetal tissue, which now they're doing horrific things like taking fresh tissue from freshly aborted babies, and this happens that you can email the Karolinska Institute and tell them what your research project is and tell them how often you want aborted baby tissue and they will send it to you. There's like a whole market for this, and the justification always goes back to are these quote unquote life-saving vaccines that are developed using these fetal cell lines. And so if we restrict fetal tissue research, if we stop taking fresh fetal tissue and grafting it into mice, which is horribly grotesque, then we're not going to come up. It's like the embryonic stem cell thing. We're not going to come up with all these quote unquote life-saving cures. We're not going to do all of this quote unquote life-saving research if we don't have access to this fetal tissue. And look what great things have already been done with these fetal cell lines. And so as you continue to use the fetal cell lines, the justification continues to exist for the use of fresh fetal tissue. They're intimately connected. You cannot separate them, at least at this point. Not in public opinion, not in any scientist's mind. It's not even a continuum. They're intimately linked. They're one and the same. If you can use aborted fetal cell lines, then you should use aborted fetal tissue for other things. And then my gut instinct as a Catholic, goes back to something I heard a very, very good theologian say. While in some circumstances with sufficiently grave cause, it might be permissible to cooperate with evil. You are never required to cooperate with evil. Never. And our faith was built on, the blood of the martyrs, the people who were unwilling to offer a single grain of incense in front of an idol. And we are willing to, commit atrocities against this individual over and over and over again as cells from, that contain their DNA, their genetic identity are trafficked, bought and sold and experimented on and discarded as refuse, and the body is never buried, and the sin just perpetuates. It's not one sin. It's not one sin of abortion. This is, laboratory justified human trafficking. And people don't think about that because it's just tissue. Just like you were saying earlier, the original justification for the abortions is like, it's just a clump of cells. We're doing that again. It's just a clump of cells. These weren't from the body of the original baby. Well, I'm sorry, who'd they come from? Whose cells are they then? Just because they weren't in that original aborted body doesn't mean they're not that baby's cells. It doesn't mean that we're not violating that baby's rights anytime these cells are used. There's more here than just the abortion. It goes much, 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 much deeper than that. And
a society that doesn't respect the sanctity of life. I mean, I think you see the same attitude, which is leaking into especially European countries, I would say, where they're saying that, or you have ethicist, I put that in quotes, Peter Sanger, who, well, if you have a Down syndrome child, well, they're a drain on society, so they should simply be euthanized. Or if you have someone who developed Alzheimer's, then well, they're a drain on society, and so they should be euthanized. And the slope keeps getting more and more slippery as you go down it to
Right.
who defines what is a worthy life or a life worth saving.
Right. Right.
And we've seen that line migrate farther and
Mm.
farther down. But I did have a question on the current vaccines, the COVID vaccines. You of course have Pfizer, you have Moderna, you have Johnson and Johnson, but then there's some other ones like the Sinovac, I think, which is the
Mm.
Chinese one. Parenthetical comment about how spectacularly successful that one has been wherever it's been used. See Qatar and Chile, for examples. But as I recall, the Pfizer one was the one that was kind of recommended as being the, I'll say, most ethical, because apparently it didn't have any clear connections to fetal cell lines. And then there was some news out recently that that's not actually true. Were all of them developed using fetal cell lines?
All of the ones that are currently available in the US were developed using fetal cell lines, and also Novavax, which people keep promoting as it's the up and coming ethical vaccine. It's not ethical. It was tested in HEK 293. You know, and I went through and kind of documented step by step in an article I wrote for LifeSite News, you know, exactly where these fetal cells were used in the development process in Pfizer and Moderna, which again is all in the published scientific literature. You know, all you have to do is go to Children of God for Life's website, and they have a great list of all of the vaccines that are currently available, or include Novavax that's pending availability, and why none of them are ethical. You know, they just kind of document it with all the footnotes and everything. And I think that you know, not to point fingers, but a particular institute that came out and said, you know, these aborted fetal cells were only used in confirmatory testing, really kind of threw people off, because people who've never worked in drug development don't really know what that means. And so what that seems to evoke in most people's heads is, oh, well, they got the vaccine already, everything's good to go, and they just did this little test over on the side to confirm whether it worked or not. And they did that in aborted fetal cells, and they really didn't need to do that in aborted fetal cells. So it's cool, it's good, it doesn't
That,
affect the world.
that would be my assumption based
Yeah.
on how they said
So
it.
there's a number of problems with that. The first one is, if you have this attitude of like, oh, well, it could have been done in a different way, and therefore, you know, it's not immoral, then the AstraZeneca vaccine is moral, because they could have done that in not in aborted fetal cells, and so, but they did. But why does it matter? Because they could have done it in something that wasn't aborted. It's a total logical fallacy. I mean, people aren't thinking this through if this is what they're thinking, you know. But the other problem is the confirmatory testing. The confirmatory, so when you develop a vaccine, you go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to however step whatever number, right? So the testing that's happening is testing that happens in order to go from step 2 to step 3 and step 5 to step 6. You know, this isn't like you got everything all finished and you did some ancillary test off to the side that wasn't necessary or didn't matter. It's an integral part of the research and development of this vaccine. You can't separate testing and development. You can't. It's not. It's again. It's like it's semantics. It's words that make us feel a little better about the situation, make us feel a little bit more removed from it. But HEK 293 was used in the development of these vaccines. Period. You know, Pfizer, Moderna, Novavax, all of them, and you could not have the product that you have without it having been used or tested or confirmed in aborted fetal cells at multiple steps of the way. I believe Pfizer was 3 steps and Moderna was 4. Maybe I have it backwards. Maybe Pfizer was 4 and Moderna was 3. But they used these aborted fetal cells multiple times, literally over and over, in order to advance the vaccine from one stage to another. And you know, which specific steps, step 2 or step 3 or step 10, it depends on the vaccine. But these were integral tests. These are not something that's happening off to the side or happening after everything's all developed. These are things that are happening as this is being developed. And again, just because I could have done it in another cell line doesn't mean that it's not immoral because I did use an unethical cell line. You know, and Dignitas Personae is very clear. These cell lines are not ethical, and researchers are obligated not to use them. You know, and
So go ahead, please
I
finish.
was going to say there's you know, distinctions that I think are proper to, I'm not the researcher using them. I'm the person in the public consuming the product, but you have to have grave cause, and this is what everybody forgets. You have to have grave cause in order to use something that is this unethical. And grave cause means, bodies stacked up in the streets, kind of grave cause. It doesn't mean I have a very small chance of dying and a slightly higher chance if I'm obese. That's not what grave cause means. um we have this distortion of the situation, which I think, as you said, probably goes back to some of the political and all the misinformation. And, there's just been a lot of fear mongering. You can't turn on any news source anywhere without people telling you how bad it is. But if you think to yourself, you ask yourself this very simple question: if nobody had told you that there was a pandemic, would you know that there was one?
Depending on where you live, no.
Right.
You really would. In Ohio right now, we are largely, COVID free as far as restrictions and things, and it's kind of a
Right.
shock for people coming from here to go to a place like New York City,
Right.
and
Right.
then suddenly run into masking requirements and not being able to have a mask off when you're sitting at a table and then at a restaurant, things like that.
Right. 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 But even if, I mean, but you know it from the masking. You don't know it from people dying. Like,
Yeah.
you
Oh,
don't know
very
about the
true.
pandemic from actual death counts or from knowing people. I mean, I do actually know 2 people who died from COVID. But they just died fairly recently, and they probably passed away primarily because they did not go in for treatment for so long. Right? Because there's kind of all these competing things going on here, where you have the people who go in and get tested right away because they're very worried about this disease, and they get told, go home, come back when you're having trouble breathing.
Hmm.
Well, I'm sorry, that's a recipe for a lot of extra death, because if I'm not actually giving you early treatment for something that you have, then that I've confirmed that you have through whatever testing, even though the testing is also questionable, but maybe we don't need to open that
You are
can.
bleeding, but we're okay right now. So go home. If you
Yeah.
lose consciousness due to lack of blood, then let us know.
Back. Drive yourself back.
Exactly. Drive
Like,
yourself in, and that's fine.
insane. And I know people that this has happened to. This isn't just me saying this based on some conservative, talking head. I know people who have gone into the emergency room. A woman who went into the emergency room whose organs were literally shutting down was basically told, "Well, you're negative for COVID. Go home." It's like, there are other diseases besides COVID going on here, right?
Mhm.
And if you have COVID, and her husband actually did have COVID, he went and was told, well, you have COVID, come back when you're having trouble breathing. He's now on oxygen for who knows how long because of the damage he sustained to his lungs. So you have people getting kicked out of hospitals, and then you have the people who, on the one hand, are so afraid to go into the hospital because they know that, statistically speaking, if I go into the hospital, they diagnose me for COVID and they put me on the ventilator, my chances of survival just from being on the ventilator drop to 40%.
Wasn't that
Okay,
amazing
already.
how that changed things? That we had to like stop production at factories because we needed ventilators. Without ventilators, we were going to kill people. And then the follow-on research after the panic was that
Mhm.
ventilators are not only causing negative outcomes from people who are COVID patients, but had people go back to look if they've ever been as helpful as they
Yeah.
were portrayed to be. That maybe the way we've been treating people with ventilators has always been wrong.
Yeah, no, mechanical ventilation is highly invasive. It puts a lot of physiological stress on your body, not to mention the stress of you know all of the hormone cascades and signaling things that go on in your body. They have to sedate you in order to put you on one of these things because it's that stressful, right? And then then you have air being mechanically forced into and sucked out of the lungs, which causes scar tissue to develop in your lungs, which causes your ability to breathe after you get off the ventilator. Suppose you survive, then your ability to breathe is damaged for the rest of your life, and the 40% figure is only if the people operating the ventilator are operating according to all the possible best practices. And in the panic
Right.
situation at the beginning of the pandemic, you're having people operate ventilators who don't know how to operate ventilators. And so you're
Yeah.
increasing your risk of death dramatically just because they don't know that actually I think it's don't quote me on this. This is go look up on YouTube, MedCram or somewhere like that where they tell you how to do this correctly. But I'm pretty sure it's if you lay the person on their back instead of on their stomach, they're more likely to die from the ventilator. And so if you don't know that, and it's kind of counterintuitive to lay somebody on their stomach when they're having trouble breathing, right?
Yeah.
Um, if you don't know that and you don't do that, you've reduced their rates of survival to something like 10%.
Yeah.
You know, and
In all the pictures I've ever seen in all the news broadcasts, I don't recall seeing one single person on their stomach, honestly. Now, I know
I'm
some of that might be stock footage. You
not
never know where they
but
get that stuff, but I'm
again,
trying to think, and I don't recall anybody.
yeah, don't quote me. And if you're a doctor, don't necessarily go out and do this. Confirm this first with an actual
Yeah,
medical professional.
that
But
would
I'm
be
pretty sure you place them on their stomachs. Um, so my friends that did pass away from COVID, the two of them, they were terrified to go to the hospital because they were literally afraid the treatment was going to kill them. And so they waited until their oxygen levels had dropped, so low that it was not able to recover from it. Because most people also don't know, if you have an oximeter at home, you can actually test your blood oxygen levels so you can determine whether you're in danger or not. Most people think, oh, well, I've got 90% oxygen, I'm good, because we think of this as like a grade. But your body is designed to carry the amount of oxygen in your blood that you need to survive. So 90% is actually extraordinarily dangerous. 90% is go to the hospital now. But most people don't know this.
yeah.
And, one of my friends, her oxygen blood level got to like 35 or something before she went into the hospital. At that point, you're going to die. Your organs are shutting down. It's not.
It's. I think that this is a separate subject, and I've touched on it with a couple other talks, which is that I think that when you look at the casualties from COVID, one of the probably the greatest one has been honestly science, with people that are walking around for political ends. I'm not going to mention parties or people that are
Right.
saying basically you should do this because the scientists say so, follow the science. And then 2 months later, like ventilators, for example,
Mhm.
oh, well, we follow the science and now there's another way to go. So now follow the science now, which is now the advice is the complete opposite of what we told you before. So what people happen is that, well, now I don't trust you at all. And again,
Right.
talking with Pastor Moss before, because
Right.
there is a lot of resistance in the Black community to these vaccines. You want to
Mhm.
talk about people that have been burned a number of times with, I'm
Right.
from the government, I'm here to help. Start with the Tuskegee Institute experiments. And
Right.
then there's various other things that have been done. Matter of fact, you alluded to one where some women thought they were going in for treatment of some kind and then ended up with a hysterectomy.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's not only just with Black women. I remember the Native American
Yeah.
women were victimized by that. So
Mhm.
the government doesn't have the best track record necessarily, or the people we like to think of the authorities and people who we should be able to trust.
Mhm.
So I think long term that's going to be the biggest casualty, which is a shame because what happened to science was abandoned.
Right.
The actual scientific inquiry was abandoned and replaced by panic and political expedience and point
Right.
scoring.
Right.
But I did have
Right.
one last question because time has flown. This has been absolutely fascinating. But so, was there another way? I mean, so there's a pandemic. They Operation Warp Speed. We need to get something out there as quickly as possible. Um, and leaving aside that everybody ignored natural immunity because you can't charge somebody for their own immune system,
Right.
and they use these fetal cell lines in order to develop. Did they have to? I mean, was that a
No.
shortcut to get to something that worked, or could they have done something else that would have been ethically sourced?
So again, this comes back to what I was talking about earlier about, you have these designer products developed specifically for use and optimized specifically for use in these cell lines. So we know how these cell lines work really well because we keep using them because, nobody's objected to them loud enough to get pharmaceutical companies to stop using them. So since nobody's objected to them, then they still use them and then they use them more and then they use them more and we have all of these things that are just optimized for use in aborted fetal cells. So to a certain extent it makes sense to the scientist of, if I have ready-made media I can just buy off the shelf to grow HEK cells. Why am I going to grow something in this new cell line that's ethical, that's not as well characterized, and do something else? And one of the other main human cell lines that's available is HeLa cells. And going back to the Black community being
Hmm.
really messed over by the government, the HeLa cells came from a woman who died, I think, of cervical cancer, and had some of her tissue was removed, and they created a cell line out of it. They didn't bother to tell her, ask her permission, anything. Of course, she was a Black woman and very poor. And this created an ethical firestorm when this is kind of discovered. And it's very frustrating to me that people are all up in arms, and they won't use the HeLa cells because the HeLa cells are unethical, but the HEK 293 are totally okay. But in the scientific community, this is totally how this goes. These cells were taken from a woman without her consent, which is bad. And this multi-million-dollar business of selling these cells and trafficking these cells was done without the family's consent or any compensation to the family for many, many years. And so people don't want to use these cells because they were obtained in an unethical way. But then they're like, oh, HEK 293 is fine. Consent was obtained from the mother, so it's all good in this way. I'm sorry you didn't obtain consent from the murdered child, and while it's obviously a sin to have violated this woman, Henrietta Lacks, in this way, it's not the same as killing an innocent baby. It's just not even in the same ballpark, and so yeah, there's just complete double standards there. But so was there justification for using them? Morally, no, absolutely not. But the people who are developing these things are going to say, but HEK 293 is used in everything. Like, why wouldn't we use it? I mean, that's what's in the literature. And this
So
is why
there were other things they could have done. This was
yeah.
this was a shortcut. This was just, oh, it's right there. I'll use it.
It was a shortcut, and it was. I mean, honestly, whether this was intentional on the part of Pfizer executives or not, what better opportunity for the culture of death to try to force everybody to participate with the sin of abortion.
I was thinking you what the saying is, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think it's fair to say the road to hell is paved with straw men. I think that in the future we'll probably be hearing that, what's the big deal? After all, this was used in these vaccines that were given to millions of people and saved millions of lives. So what's the problem? It's the largest validation that I think will be given for
and
future.
it's especially with the mandates and things. You're also, I mean, the largest mass scale coercion of people's consciences that I've ever seen. I know men who got vaccinated because if they didn't get vaccinated, they were going to lose their livelihood and not be able to support their family. And how do you make that choice? How do you judge somebody for making that choice? Because even though I would personally never take these things, and I think they're horribly immoral, I mean, what option do some of these guys have? It's such a nightmare, because I think that the better option is to stand strong and resist. But I can't throw a guy under the bus who's like, I've got 8 kids and this is my only way to put bread on the table, and I just got vaccinated.
And it's to be honest, it's actually worse than that. And in New York State, which seems to be the epicenter for dumb ideas, that if you refuse to get vaccinated, and I have a friend who is a nurse, she quit before the deadline, because at the deadline, I'm not sure this was published as opposed to one of these things that was simply made known, so there's no trail. But what they were going to do is put a petition in to get her license pulled to be a nurse, as well as anyone else who refused to get vaccinated. And I believe that they had something, they may have backed down when it went public, but it was also going to be used as justification for you not to collect unemployment benefits.
Well, yeah, they're using it as justification to turn people away from hospitals. If you're not vaccinated, don't come in for
the transplant case in Colorado.
Yes, exactly. If you're not vaccinated, you're not eligible for a transplant. If you're not vaccinated, you can't. Not that I support organ donation, but you can't donate your organs. I guess I support non-vital organ donation. I can give you a kidney and I can still be okay. But it just it's some of these things are absolutely unreal. I never thought, even a year ago, I never thought I would live in a society where we would literally be denying people medical care because they refuse to participate in a giant morally coercive science experiment. because we still don't know. Everybody says, oh, there's no evidence of long-term harm from these vaccines. Well, shocker, we've only been giving them out for a year.
Well,
There's
at
no
the
evidence
moment,
of anything. There's no evidence of long-term safety or of long-term harm because there's just no
exactly.
evidence.
There's no evidence. Actually, the evidence starting to come in, interestingly enough, that they don't work long term.
No,
Which is why
no,
now we're doing boosters, apparently, until the end of time.
which is
And
also
not
very
only that, I mentioned, I had sent over some notes, the idea of the leaky vaccines, where these vaccines are so targeted that they allow people who have had the vaccines, this is just me speculating and such based on the data that I've seen, that they actually lead to almost this petri dish where it will take out the very specific variant, but it'll allow other variants to multiply happily because they're not affecting you, they're not exciting your immune system. And
well,
that's why we've seen, unlike flu, a complete explosion in worldwide variants.
yeah. So they actually are activating your immune system, but it's this really weird phenomenon. It's called original antigenic sin, which is just a really cool name.
Yeah,
But
it is. That was the name of my high school garage band.
It's awesome. So you've got this whole range of epitopes, right? This whole range of spike proteins, and you've got this spike protein, which is kind of similar to this one, which is kind of similar to this one, which is kind of similar to this one, which is like most different from this one, right? So if I get infected with this virus over here, and then later I get infected with this virus over here, I'm going to mount a completely new immune response, right? And so it's like I got the virus all over again. If I get infected with this virus over here, I'm going to mount a memory response because I already got infected with this virus, and these viruses are so similar, right?
Sure.
And that's good. That actually keeps me from developing symptoms of illness again. But if I get infected with this virus over here, it's similar enough that my immune system thinks it's seen it before. So it activates that memory response, but it's different enough that I get immune escape. So I actually get sick again anyway. Because it's similar enough that my body is reacting. I actually get sicker because my body is mounting an immune response, which is what causes all the symptoms of sickness anyway. So it's mounting this immune response, but then it's not effective because the antibodies don't bind really strongly because that particular variant is just a little bit too different. But this is exactly what we're doing with the vaccines. We're showing your body just one little part of this virus. Is sort of like trying to show some policemen like this much of my face and say, okay, track her down. So that's what we're doing to your immune system. You're not seeing the whole virus in context. You're just seeing this tiny little fraction of it. And if the tiny little fraction of it sort of vaguely resembles, the variant you get infected with, but not enough that your antibodies actually bind really strongly to the spike protein of that variant, you're hosed because your immune resources are being pumped into this memory response, which is not effective. Okay, so you're going to spend days, feeling sick and not actually getting any neutralization of the virus until your immune system wakes up and says, "Wait, this isn't working. I need to do something else." I mean, obviously not volitionally, but you'll mount a second immune response once the virus starts proliferating and your body recognizes, "Hey, this isn't working." But until then, you're going to get sicker and you're actually more likely to die. And
more likely to spread to
and more likely to spread
the virus.
Yeah. So it's just kind of, I mean, the idea that we could contain something like the flu or like the common cold or like a highly transmissible coronavirus with a vaccine is just kind of silly because it's going to spread anyway. You're going to get it anyway. You're going to have breakthrough infections. One of my dear friends, God bless him, got the COVID vaccine, which kind of devastated me, but then he got COVID after that. Like, dude, why? You violated your conscience and then you got sick anyway.
Well, I think actually that before I kind of draw things to a close, I think that was interesting. I found a comment. Apparently, this was from the Vatican, where they were saying that it was morally acceptable for specific vaccines. But the final line they had was that if some of the faithful do not choose to take the vaccine for reasons of conscience, at least they actually had an exception, unlike the government of New York.
Right.
The Vatican says those persons must do their utmost to avoid becoming vehicles for the transmission of the infectious agent, which it seems to me like the vaccines unwittingly, biology is hard, have kind of become in turning people into potential transmitters for,
Mhm.
and maybe even the petri dishes for the
Right.
variants.
Well, it's
I
sort
just
of like the
irony,
issue
the green
with
courtesy phone.
oh, what's that? I'm sorry?
I said irony, answer the green courtesy phone.
Exactly. Um, so it's kind of like the situation with the HPV vaccine, I think, honestly. People were concerned about giving their kids the HPV vaccine because they said, hey, wait, if my kid thinks they're protected from STDs, they're likely to engage in more risky behavior. And this is actually also why you don't really want to hand out condoms to kids or things like that. Because if they think they're protected, they're more likely to engage in high risk behavior. Well, the same thing is happening with the COVID vaccine. They think they're protected, so they're more likely to engage in behavior that would it cause them to catch or transmit the vaccine or the virus. So there's a little bit of that, psychology coming into play here too. But then you have I think you have the bigger problem with the immune escape. So the virus is going to replicate in these individuals for longer, making them infectious for longer, which would make them, on average more infectious. And again, it just depends on, you don't contain illnesses like this with herd immunity. We've never gotten rid of the flu. We've never gotten rid of the common colds.
Yeah, fair
Just
point.
these
I
these are
actually,
they're highly variable. They're highly infectious, and they actually don't kill their hosts. And that's why they don't go away. They become endemic because they don't kill people. Because it's in the virus's best interest to not kill you. Because if it kills you too quickly, it's not gonna go on to infect somebody else.
yeah, a deadly virus is kind of a failed evolutionary effect because
Yeah,
you're
I
not
mean
prolonging yourself.
yeah.
Well, we've had a lovely talk, and time has continued to go here. So we do have to bring this to a close. As interesting as this is, it was a shame. I have other things that I would bring up, but I think that this is a good spot. I
Okay.
certainly hope to renew this conversation at a later time. Maybe post this to the website and post the video later. But I do want to say thank you again for taking a little more time than I'd expected
That's
to cover everything. Goodness knows there's so many issues around this, not just with the scientific, but the sociological and the political and the
Yeah, we
cultural
kind of barely scratched the
and
surface,
and and everything else. It's I hope that we're learning a lot from this when
Mhm.
historians look back at this and shake their head sadly that this is going to have a lot of data points people will be able to use in the future.
Mhm.
But so thank you again for coming. I'll put the information up on your book and where to get it for people who are interested in. But if people are interested in hearing more and reading your articles and in other publications, where's the best place that they would go to find you outside of Google and typing in?
Right, which is probably censored anyway.
Yes,
So
it's on.
they can go to LifeSite News. I've written a couple of articles for LifeSite News and also did an interview with John Henry Weston back in January on the aborted fetal cell connection with vaccines. And they can also go to the Kolbe Center for the Study of Creation, which is kolbecenter.org, and it's spelled like St. Maximilian Kolbe, not like the cheese. Some
Yes.
people try to spell it that way though. So you won't get to the right place if you do that.
AOLBE. Yeah.
So
Maximilian Kolbe was actually the saint I adopted when I was at my uh, confirmation. So
oh, that's
yeah,
wonderful.
soft spot in my heart for him.
Yeah. I have a good soft spot for him too. He was one of my first saint friends. But so the book is available through that website. And if anybody is interested in contacting me, they can send an email to the Kolbe Center. It'll get forwarded to me. Um, and then the other place that you can find a little bit of what I've done is Census Fidelium's channel on YouTube. So I've done a few interviews there, as well as a couple with Restoring the Faith, and then there's a lady named Nicole. Call to Act. Call to Act. I did a couple of interviews also for Call to Act. So I tend to pop up in little random Catholic corners of the world. Fatima Center too. I think I did an interview for them. So uh yeah, those places are good places to pick up on more of what the book is about. Some of them are on vaccines in general, some of them are COVID vaccine in particular, some of them are aborted fetal cells and vaccines, and then I've given some talks on creation and evolution as well, where I look at the biology that actually debunks Darwinism. So those are an interesting side foray if you're really just like watching me talk or something. So,
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you very much for spending your time with us today. Thank you, everybody who's been listening to this conversation. I have to do a little bit of editing to make sure it all fits within the hour I've set up for this. And I truly hope that we get a chance to talk to you again. I think this was fascinating. And I do have to say for the listeners that the occasional sounds you heard were children defeating the noise filters. And every once in a while, you heard what might have sounded like somebody stepped on a puppy's tail. No, those are angry children in the background. They're all fine. They just wanted chocolate milk.
No children were actually harmed in the making of this video.
So, exactly. So they're good. So thank you everybody for watching. Thank you to Pamela for spending time with us, and stay tuned to the Life Tech channel for more content. Talk to you later.